Good evening, friends. Thank you for being so good-humored, and thank you for coming to us in such large numbers. We are very honored to have you, and indeed I'm extraordinarily pleased to have our wonderful panel this evening. Let me introduce them first, then say a few words, very few, and then we can get on with our speakers and engage in the conversation we're here to have. Our speakers will speak, I think, for between about 15 minutes each, after which we will have a discussion across the panel and then through the audience. Our speakers today are Sugata Bose to my left, the Gardiner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs at Harvard, and he is currently serving as a member of India's Parliament from the Jadavpur constituency in West Bengal. He is confronting at the moment in Parliament what we call a saffron wave, a wave of the Hindu right, and I think we all need to send Sugata away from here, away from this room, with all the courage and congratulations we can offer him for taking on such a remarkably complex and difficult task. Sugata Bose. Antanas Mockus, on my right, is the former mayor of Bogota and the former rector of the National University of Colombia. During his time as mayor, homicides in Bogota decreased by nearly 75%, and traffic fatalities went down by half, in large part because of what Doris Sommer describes as his inventive collective performance of civic culture. Very much hoping that he will perform a little for us this evening too. Thank you very much, Antanas. Thank you for being here. He also has a job on his hands. Please give him a... Yeah. And then finally, there is Doris Summer, the Ira Jewell Williams Jr. Professor of Romance Languages and Literature and Director of the Cultural Agents Initiative. Doris has done yeoman service to a whole range of our students who, through her, connect to civic projects outside of the university. She brings makes the walls of the university porous, brings people from outside in and inside out. She has a recent book, The Work of Art in the World, Civic Agency and the Public Humanities. Now, let me editorialize. A hand for Doris Sommer. Really, the issues we are gathered here today to talk about, I think, are enormously important. They're important within the university, within this university and other universities, where the spirit in the arts and humanities is extraordinarily high, but the general context for the arts and humanities is difficult. And if it is difficult in universities like ours, it is extraordinarily difficult in other countries too. And I hope Professor Bose will say something about that. So the arts and humanities are in a precarious, difficult, and vulnerable situation. And they also happen to be absolutely critical for civic life, because it's through the arts and humanities that we not only learn the art of interpretation, and interpretation is not simply a philological or textual performance, although it is very importantly a philological and textual importance, but it is as important in the analysis of social, cultural, and political movements. So the whole question of interpretation is enormously important. And what the humanities do, I think, better in my way of thinking than the sciences, is they make you aware that every mode of interpretation, indeed every moment of interpretation, is an ethical act. There is no way that in the humanities you can engage with any social phenomenon or any textual phenomenon without bearing the ethical responsibility of judgment and decision. You cannot say, I'm going to under the table do a little magic with these experiments, and then because at the end it's going to be very important. You can't do that. The means and the processes are as important for us in the humanities, and therefore I submit to you that every good person wants to improve the world, but the humanities gives you a very specific task, the task of incremental, step-by-step, everyday ethical engagement and everyday responsibility. Now, of course, we live in worlds where there are hugely uncivic conditions and movements. These are often due to the inequalities and disjunctions that happen in our society, where the disavowal or denial of freedom, of equality, of justice, drives people to taking advantage and making acts, performing acts which can be only in the short-term interests of themselves, and yet the extremity of the conditions of life push them to these moments. At that point, I think, in such conditions, the arts and humanities play a major role. And they play a major role because their emphasis on what I have called ethical process and practice teaches us a great lesson that I learned from a phrase of Romain Rolland that Gramsci repeated many times in his work: the pessimism of the intelligence and the optimism of the will, i.e., careful interpretation, judgment, reading, no overestimation of oneself or others, no brouhaha, no self-congratulation. Keep the narcissism as much under check as possible, even when everything points to forms of egoism in leadership, the pessimism of the intelligence, and the optimism of the will. One of the great contributions, of course, of the arts and the humanities is to take affect seriously. Not only the political and the ethical, but with it the question of affect, empathy, sympathy, hospitality, caring, nurturing. There is no act or object in the world of the arts and humanities that does not evoke action and agency without evoking affectivity. And I hope that some of these issues will be raised today as we begin slowly and consummately to understand what it means to create in our midst not only political, legal, and social citizenship, but a politics, an ethics, and an aesthetics of cultural citizenship. Thank you very much. Let me invite the Jewell professor, Doris Sommer, the Jewell professor, to lead us off with a few thoughts.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand for two reasons, so I can show you some pictures and also so I can see you. That's too small.
How do you see the pictures?
I began to ask myself questions that led to cultural agency over a dozen years ago when I noticed that some of our best students in arts and humanities were leaving us as graduate students, sometimes as undergraduate students, for what they called more useful fields. And so I stayed back in my office feeling less useful than they needed. Well, and I wondered why I was feeling less useful, when I know, for example, as Homi already referenced, that the issues of ethics and judgment especially begin in the humanities, begin, in fact, with aesthetic philosophy. And just to be very brief about this, in the Enlightenment, reason seems to be the human faculty par excellence. And Kant, as you know, developed two critiques that present reason as pure reason or scientific reason, and as practical reason or social reason. But he saw, after he wrote those two big critiques, that something was missing. What was missing was precisely the unreasonable faculty of judgment. Judgment is not reasonable. Judgment doesn't have a track that it follows. It pauses and it asks itself about options and about the value of the process of reason. Without that pause, there's no free thought. And if you've read Kant's essay on what is the Enlightenment, it's about thinking freely in public. It has to be in public because otherwise you don't get any debate, you don't get any feedback, and you can go off on your own track. How do you think freely, though, if you don't have judgment? And how do you achieve judgment if reason doesn't bring us there? Well, that was a problem for him. So he asks himself, what excites us enough to want to think about it and judge, and is free from interest and will allow us to think freely and to judge freely? Certainly not economics, because I'm always interested. Not morality either, because I'm interested. Even conceptual thinking is interested because I want to confirm or not an idea that I have, a concept that I have. What's the only thing, he says, that will keep us engaged and excited long enough with no interest, no preconceptual ties? And his answer, as you know from the title of the third critique on aesthetic judgment, is aesthetics. That's the only thing that will keep us buzzed enough to want to think about it, and even more, and this I understood better reading Hannah Arendt on Kant, and I remember that Diana and I were in a reading group where we read Arendt on Kant. That was an important moment for me. It doesn't only keep us buzzed enough to think freely, it makes us dependent on other people's thinking. Because when I am surprised, and aesthetics is always a surprise, and slightly confused because there's no concept that's leading me, I have no one to appeal to, no vertical truth to appeal to. I need to ask the person next to me, what did you think? Did that do something for you? Was that really an expression or an experience of beauty? And that lateral relationship is a relationship that is achieved through aesthetic judgment, not through anything that's interested. It's the basis of free social relationships. It's the one place where philosophy, Arendt says, is horizontal and not vertical. So knowing this, I said to myself, why is this faculty of judgment dismissed, considered unimportant? Why is technological development going along as if it's going to solve our problems when we know that Gramsci understood a revolution had to come step by step, as Homi said, and through cultural changes? My best model at that point, over a dozen years ago, was Augusto Boal, whom some of you know from theater, who developed a theater that multiplied facilitators, not directors. And one of my students, in a course that I was doing on aesthetics, said to me, if you're really serious about cultural agents, Professor Sommer, you need to talk to my mother and her boss. I said, okay, I'm serious. Who's your mother and her boss? Well, it turned out to be the Vice Mayor of Bogota, Alicia Eugenia Silva, and Antanas Mockus, who happened to be visiting that week. And that visit changed my life, because Antanas grounded all of the aesthetic theory that I thought I was learning into a real practice. As a philosopher, as a mathematician, as someone who knows how to turn hunches into measurable practices. Someone who puts the advances that he succeeds in igniting into graphs that cured my allergy to numbers and graphs. You know, the most eloquent expression of the art that Antanas promoted in Bogota are these graphs that show the reduction in homicide, as Homi said, and the rise in tax paying, in engagement in general. I learned from Antanas many important lessons. One is that without pleasure, and here Gramsci is an important model for us too. Without pleasure, there's no lasting social change. Because what happens if you try to impose change without pleasure? You get instead resistance, rebellion, resentment. But when it's pleasurable, people assume these changes with their own will. Here is the first and famous intervention that Antanas made in Bogota in 1995. He was elected in a desperate city. For a month, Antanas would ask his aides, especially his Secretary of Culture, give me an idea. Let's do something about traffic deaths before we go after the drug lords. Let's just show the city that change is possible. And the Secretary of Culture came back every day that month and said, I don't have an idea. Antanas said, think a little more. Finally, the secretary came back and said, I was so desperate, I asked my cranky father-in-law for some advice. And the old man said, nothing to be done, kid. It's time to bring out the clowns. Well, Antanas, as a good artist, knows how to take a joke seriously, turn an insult into, a friendly suggestion. So he said, let's try it. And he fired 20 of the many corrupt traffic cops in the center of Bogota and hired mimes with no authority. The mimes couldn't give you a ticket, they couldn't put you in jail, they couldn't do anything legally binding. But they had the charm of engaging the public as co-authors of a new moment in Bogota. Everyone on the street was a participant. Everyone either laughed or imitated or participated in some way. And this was a watershed for many other activities. Let me show you just a little bit of these
Yo
mimes.
recuerdo que cuando él empezó, inventó los mimos, la prensa se reía de Antanas.
De estos largos y oscuros túneles ubicados bajo el centro de Bogotá, se preparan 20 jóvenes que pretenden enseñarles a los habitantes de la ciudad cómo vivir civilizadamente en una capital.
Es a través del arte, ¿sí? A través de nuestra postura de la estética y de la ética, vamos a poner en servicio nuestro trabajo para dar educación ciudadana.
Yo recuerdo.
This is another art piece called Super Cívico. Antanas remembers the name of the artist who suggested it to him. I forgot his name.
Journalist came with the dress, and I put it thinking it was for once, but it's become a notable thing in 24 hours. So I put it 3 times. And the third time, a woman that was passing by said, "Mayor, go to work."
So this is one of the many examples of Antanas trying something. It works, but then you change your mind because art is always on the move. This was one of the conversations we had in the Cultural Agents class today. How do we make the value of art stick? Well, Friedrich Schiller taught us that it always is on the move. It works by trial and error. It works because you continue to be creative, and Antanas continues always to be creative. Here's another. Oh, do we have the? This is another project with another artist. Antanas developed this campaign to stop traffic deaths in the streets, in the dangerous streets of Bogota. People would just ignore crosswalks, ignore red lights. That's why the mimes were important. But also these black stars with the yellow frames that look like police tape littered the streets. You saw one star on top of another on top of another, and these were commemorations of traffic deaths, and people started noticing. It was part of this campaign that reduced the traffic deaths dramatically, even within the first year. I want to just mention a parallel project in Tirana, Albania. Some of you may have heard the current Prime Minister of Albania speak last week. This is a visual artist, a painter, who managed to change the capital city and was elected Prime Minister because he could produce these before and after pictures, demolishing illegal structures and simply making visual jokes of buildings that had been boring. But the difference, and I think I'll end here, the difference between one kind of art and another is the difference in sustainability, in continuity, in respect for fellow citizens. It's the difference between thinking of artists as isolated geniuses, the way Immanuel Kant thought of artists, and thinking of all of us as realized or potential artists, the way Kant's disciple Schiller talked about art. He identified what he calls a third drive in the human condition. We are not simply human beings because we have reason and passion. If we had only reason and passion, we would be civil wars, on 2 legs. But because we have a third drive, which he called the play drive, the drive to be creative, we can turn conflict into new and beautiful forms that get old, and we need to try newer and newer forms. And Antanas is an embodiment of that Schillerian call to collective creativity, and that's why it's a sustainable program. Rama now, as Prime Minister, thinks that art has finished its work because he no longer does it, and he's not activating other artists. But in Colombia today, I can tell you, because I just heard the president of the country say this in public, Antanas Mockus is the model for constructing a lasting peace in the country. His model of engaging citizens from every walk of life into co-creating art projects in public with each other is what will save Colombia from continuing civil war. So I'm delighted, honored to be here with Antanas. He's the hero of my book. I just try to embroider some theory around the practice and the thinking that goes into his work. And it's a theme that I'm very happy to share with you because I'm very eager to continue conversations with you about Colombia, about the United States, about India, about any place that you are passionate enough about to want to change with pleasure and in a sustainable way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doris. That's very kind of you to set us off. your comments, please. Would you like to speak there, or you can speak from here?
I want to see the faces.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for inviting me. Creativity is not something that you can order. If someone asks me to be creative, it's not easy. One of the things is taking things, language, literally. We were discussing where to marry with my wife, and she said in the circus. It was a joke, but a joke helped to open a door. The name of the book of Doris Sommer, The Work of Art in the World, is tremendously wide. The work of the art in the world. It's in singular. She could write also a text, the functions or the roles of art in the world, or of some art, of arts. No, she put in singular. And I think that's a sort of mark of a manifesto. Let's speak to the world. Let's engage more art into our word-making projects. This book is an invitation to all cultural agents of the planet, and it's based on real-life examples. In memoriam of Schiller, Gramsci, Brecht, Freire, Paulo Freire, Augusto Boal, and some low visible people like Orlando Falsborda, Carlo Federici, José Granés, and Guillermo Hoyos, among many others, who understood that it wasn't enough to contemplate culture. When Doris invited me to a pretexts workshop with recyclers in Bogota, I was first amazed because they were real recyclers with a lot of stuff for making real recycling. But what we were going to do was books, but books beginning with the object, not with the text. I discovered that literature is also recycled material, because during the workshop, while people were working with the papers, the scissors and so on, Doris had someone reading a text. And remembering that this was made in Cuba, while the women that were producing the cigars worked, there was, by arrangement with the union, someone reading novels or reading newspapers. What human activity is not an art of recycling? Every form, everything from thinking, teaching, and learning, and all forms of association, recycle previous performance. In all these fields, very different fields, there are past performances that inspire new performance. And many times you do not get a centimeter further. You can get back. The variations multiply, the variations of performances multiply quickly when they adopt writing and other technologies of communication. The pretexts workshop is, in my way of thinking, the best promoter of written text. As rector of the university, I was a completely foolish defender of texts. People had to write text. And the conflict with the art teachers was tremendous, because I said, your art, your work in art is valuable for the university only if you explain it rationally. So I put reason over passion, of course, but also over sensitivity and desire to play. But under the pressure, all this history is a history of pressures. A pressure of arts professor obliged me, just appointed as rector, to lie on the table and make half of the conference looking to the ceiling. So in 1 week, I had changed my point of view. So art has its languages. And these special languages are very useful. Culture itself survives only when it is permanently shared and recycled. Cultural agents are not in danger of extinction. On the contrary, today our numbers grow and our ever more necessary work reaches unprecedented dimensions, with or without written records. Technological advances increase the potential of cultural interventions. Every cultural worker has thousands of technical possibilities, which increase the options to organize horizontally. No wonder the traditional middle classes and some old money elites are concerned. For them, broad-based education in the arts and humanities is, in the best case, irrelevant, and in the worst, quite dangerous, because it undermines the conventional order of things with new forms of civil resistance. When and how do cultural workers become cultural agents? When do they connect students and colleagues to real-world issues rather than neutralize creative energies? It is when we take seriously the potential of arts and interpretation to deliberately promote positive change. Agency can be exercised by government, taking advantage of its visibility and taking advantage also of the margins of freedom associated with elected officials. I felt free. Art can even become the main approach to an elected leader, as seems to be the case of Edi Rama in Tirana. Governing is similar to art making. Aristotle called governing the supreme art. In both in governing and in arts, restriction turns into advantage. Artists do more with less. That's why John Elster explains rational choice theory with examples from making art. Paradoxically, the freedom to innovate in the diverse media increases to the degree that measurable outcomes are required. So, pressure on technification of government. My own surprising experience in government has taught me that the more Cartesian my program, the more I insisted on rationally evaluated outcomes, the more it also supported me. It also supported, my free play through art to facilitate understanding and popular approval of public policies. So art was stronger while management was stronger. Reliability of the technical part of the government authorized us to play. We had a march for playing. Raising the bar on rational deliberation, intensifying the use of written reports and statistical graphs, also multiplied opportunities for art to participate in collective processes, turning apparently impossible objectives into invitations to play. It is true that dissatisfaction with existing conditions often follows from ethical rather than aesthetical concerns. One can feel outrage at the paralyzing despair that allows leaders and citizens to tolerate the intolerable. Here, a little critical distance goes a long way to overcome pessimism. Finding the nonconformity of even grade school children who normally propose or demand something can stimulate the energy for actions. Some homeworks can become a letter to the mayor or a letter to the health system and so on. Taking seriously scholar exercises is my main recommendation. A little girl, 9-year-old, asked, "How can I be like you?" And trusting professors, teachers. In some sense, academic people in very special conditions have some kind of ideas that other people can use, that can be useful. Alvin Gulner was an American sociologist who wrote a very harsh book. He was wrong in many predictions, but he said the book was clear in its name. The progress, no, the rise of new class, the future of intellectuals. Exploring assumptions of validity and allowing ourselves to be swayed by the force of argument in order to reach agreements should be explicit goals. Early and often he says, sorry, I'm reading like a small boy. Oh, you read it a lot better than. Okay. Taste needs training, as Schiller insisted when we showed how reason and passion collide in ways that summon a third drive, the play drive. Spiel in German means a range of creative activities, from games of chance to performance acts. In Lithuanian language, this is Spiga, and it comes from the same Spiel. Spiel in German means a range of creative activities from games of chance to performance arts. Gabriel Celaya is a poet that says, poetry cannot be just beautiful without becoming sinful. Doris invites us to explore what happens when people, all of us, bridge academic learning with an aesthetic sense of life. This is an urgent exploration that can bring pedagogy and politics into dialogue with art. But it's not new. Her call to action is grounded on standard aesthetic theory, which, as she reminds us in the book, responds to political crisis. And with that grounding, she peoples the book with a range of effective creative agents. Asomos. Hints. Her book is full of hints, very dense. Hints, very different. For example, in workshops, for many years, I used to use hazard, chance, as a way of choosing the members of the groups. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And she made this kind of grouping with classifying, with the help of the people, the ethical problem that was the most important for each one of them. And so the groups, when they were invited to illustrate by making theater an urban tragedy, a small urban tragedy, these people that had similar values were being very effective in the building of the scene. Well, it's not for always grouping people by their ethical orientation, but it shows that the book, so when you are in the workshop and you read the book, things become more solid. Asomos hints are everyday epiphanies. For a short moment, you see the future present. You cannot make this at your launching. I cannot feel again what I felt one day looking from a mountain to Bogota. I can't describe it in words, and I have written it. The city seemed a very big animal being. It was full of life. Asomos hints fade, but art recuperates colors. Hints, asomos, have the immediate force of evidence. Well, many years ago, I knew that the work could be reinterpreted by the academia. Piaget was reinterpreted here, and the first Piaget in Europe was a moral psychologist. Here he became a cognitive psychologist. Fortunately, Kolber rescued the moral Piaget, also here. So imagine a mayor, but there are a lot of other cases that place a little bit in new forms of communicating, in new forms of listening, placing perhaps in the center of the scene interpretation, changing the question, is the mayor effective, by the question, what is the sense of what the mayor is doing? So at the beginning, many times, they thought that I had no idea. Well, in some sense, here, by choosing to read the text, I have, well, sorry, I should speak with a very limited English instead of working a sort of pretentious, sophisticated text. And yes, well, what I can say in English is a lot narrower than what I can say in Spanish. But the main things perhaps have been said. Thank you very much.
Sugata Bose.
Oops. What's that? A few weeks ago, Homi and Doris and Steve and I were struggling to find a title for this panel. I now know what we should have called it: from Bogota to Kolkata. I was born and grew up in the city of Kolkata, often described as the cultural capital of India, to be distinguished from Mumbai, the commercial capital, Homi's city, or New Delhi, the political capital. Now, this is not to say that Mumbai is devoid of culture, even though Kolkata is rather bereft of commerce. The reputation of Kolkata as a fount of cultural production goes back to a bilingual intelligentsia whose literature, art, theatre, and film turned it into a very vibrant space from about the 1810s to the 1970s. One of the key figures who made sure that art and politics converged in Kolkata was, of course, none other than the great poet Rabindranath Tagore. When he opposed Curzon's partition of Bengal in 1905 during the Swadeshi, or own country movement, he decided to tie colored threads called Rakhi on the wrists of Hindus and Muslims as a symbol of the effective bond between siblings. Of course, he also wrote many songs that were to be performed in Calcutta's public spaces.
Are we going to have a performance tonight?
We'll see later. But he also had a nephew, Rabindranath Tagore, who learned the Japanese wash technique from Yokoyama Taikan and painted the iconic image of the nation as mother, which you see here. And this image was then copied onto a giant silk scroll by Hishida Shunso, and then it was taken around and paraded around the city of Calcutta in a procession. So the artist, as an interpreter of politics, has a very distinguished lineage in my city. Now today, Kolkata, unlike Bogota, does not have mimes directing traffic or poking fun at transgressors of traffic rules. But ever since the change of government in West Bengal that happened in 2011, Tagore songs are played at all traffic signals. Now, I'm not sure whether this has brought about a decrease in the number of traffic deaths, but what I can say is that despite the inadequate acoustics during rush hour at Esplanade, it has probably reduced incidents of road rage. Now, this is in some ways a trivial example, which is constantly derided by critics, but beyond this, I actually cannot find examples of creative political interventions from the top in any of India's major cities in recent decades. Now, India did have some very great mayors during the period of the freedom struggle. And that was a period when the British had the All India Centre firmly within their own grasp. They offered a little bit of local self-government. So, for example, in the city of Kolkata, giants of the independence movement like Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das or Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose were elected mayor of Kolkata, Calcutta as it was called then, in the 1920s and early 1930s. And they introduced many innovative experiments in municipal socialism. K.F. Nariman, a Parsi lawyer who shot to fame in Bombay during the late 1920s by exposing a huge financial scandal being perpetrated by the British in the name of a Back Bay reclamation. Nariman served as mayor of that great city in the mid-1930s. Nariman Point still bears his name. Now, I will let Homi comment on the role of mayors belonging to the Shiv Sena in more recent decades and the role that they have played in the domain of the arts, culture, and politics. In fact, since 1996, Mumbai has continuously had Shiv Sena mayors. But at a more general level, what I would like to say is that power, since independence in India, has resided in New Delhi or at the level of the state. And that is why, possibly, we have not had great mayors or even mayoral candidates of the kind we have seen in the Americas, both North and South. So that's one possible explanation. The other explanation might be that Antanas Mockus is in fact something of an exception even in Latin America. Now in Doris's book, there is a beautiful quote. Antanas sees the city as a huge classroom, his deputy mayor, Alicia Silva, said to Doris during the research for this book. And since I have been teaching in classrooms which look very different from the ones that I'm used to here at Harvard during the past 6 months, I thought I would give you a quick visual impression of that city and its environments as the basis for a conversation across oceans and continents. So I represent Jadavpur. This is, of course, an auto rickshaw and a poster calling for the electorate to vote for me. This is a fascinating constituency that I represent. It has 7 segments. Jadavpur and Taliganj are fully urban within the city of Kolkata, and it contains many refugees from erstwhile East Bengal. The other 5 segments, which are Baruipur, west and east, Sonarpur, north and south, and Bhangra, are primarily rural, but they have 2 urban nodes in Baruipur town and the Sonarpur Rajpur municipality. Now, Bhangra in particular, this part, is a very neglected Muslim-majority rural belt, sandwiched between the booming urban sprawl of what is called Rajarhat New Town, near the Kolkata International Airport, and the Bashanti Highway, along which tourists go to the Sundarbans. So this is Bhangra, and this is a poster of mine, but these are the kinds of classrooms that I found there. If you read the mainstream bourgeois press, you would think that only criminals live in Bhangra. But in fact, of course, they are ordinary people struggling to eke out a living who are watching the major urban sort of kind of boom that is taking place all around them that has left them completely behind. And what you see here are large numbers of women. There is a bit of a segregation. Mostly women are on one side, the men on the other, but they are there in large numbers in this classroom. Here again, you see large numbers of women who have come out to a public meeting. And these are the various sort of rallies that took place. This is one of my mother addressing a public meeting. Now, what I would say is that, there are huge election expenses, which are mostly wasteful, that take place during parliamentary elections. But one positive spin-off is that some part of this money percolates down to graffiti artists and other creative designers. Now, this is in Sonarpur, and I'm on a jeep somewhere here, and since the procession had taken a turn, I was able to take this picture on my iPhone. My name, Sugata Bose, these are like cards which have been placed on what are called vans in Bengal, but these are not motorized vans. These are just wooden planks drawn by cycles. And usually children go to schools sitting on these planks. And what some creative person had done was to put these cards bearing my name onto 5 vans which were leading the procession that wound its way through the village. And here you see I chanced upon someone who had just written my first name and then was putting these geometric patterns onto the letters of the alphabet. Most of these pictures were, as I said, taken by me on my iPhone, but then a Bangalore professional photographer showed up one day and followed me on the campaign trail. So here are some pictures of that. And then what happened was that the 9th of May was the second last day of the campaign, and to the great consternation of my campaign team, I said that I was suspending my campaign for that day in order to celebrate Tagore's birthday. And I have to say that the electorate preferred my academic lectures on Tagore's views regarding cultural difference than conventional political speeches, especially when it came interspersed with some music. So I did have to campaign on the last day, so here are some pictures of the campaign finishing in the streets of Calcutta. But once I won, I found myself in another kind of classroom. And it was not until I had entered the hallowed precincts of the Lok Sabha, the House of the People, that I understood the true meaning of the aesthetic gap between the represented and the representation that Anka Schmidt has written about with such great insight. But it was still possible to communicate with the represented, the underrepresented, and the unrepresented, because Parliament, I discovered, was a classroom which was a bit akin to a MOOC, which had lots of auditors outside that particular classroom. And history and humanities still mattered. So the day after I gave my speech on the budget in July, the Economic Times reported, history lessons are not generally expected as part of a debate on the union budget, but Bose delivered just that kind of a lesson, not just to poke holes in the budget that had been presented, but also to call into question the ruling party's project of cultural nationalism, which was being put forth in the budget by naming various schemes after their icons. And there was a kind of an appropriation of the icons of the freedom movement that was then sort of taking place. So what I will end with is this, that culture is certainly not a panacea for the social and political and economic ills that afflict India. I say this simply to inject an element of realism, not pessimism, into our conversation. India has a prime minister today who has been a lifelong pracharak or propagandist of a self-avowed cultural organization, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the National Volunteer Association, once banned in India for being implicated in the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. And it is a particular type of cultural agents who have all of the instruments of the state machinery at their disposal at the moment. So the opposition can at best provide some cultural, counter narratives. And I don't want to be too pessimistic, and which is why I will finish by agreeing with something that Doris Sommer says in the early part of her book. It is an optimism of the will beyond the despair of reason that drives life forward towards social commitments and creative contributions. And just to see if I can give you a little glimpse of what the classroom looks like, I will try to play off YouTube if it comes on. A little bit, I'll forward it so that you just hear 1 or 2 minutes of it, of what I had to say on culture. As part of the debate on the President's address, it is a time-honored convention Okay, let's see if I can give you the...
Even the worst sinner, it is said, can find redemption with a dip in its holy waters. The river is our mother in Bengal as much as it is for the residents of Benares. You will be happy to know that our poet, Qazi Nazrul Islam, did not write just about the Ganga. He sang, Ganga Sindhu Narmoda Kaveri Jamuna Oi, Bohiya Choleche Ager Moto, Koi she Ager Manush Koi. The Ganga and the other great rivers flow on as before. Where are the human beings of yesteryears? That poetic lament, laced with nostalgia, is probably more poignant now than it was in Nazrul Islam's time. But it is the lines sung in the immortal voice of Bhupen Hajarika that is haunting me today. বিস্তীর্ণ দুপারের অসংখ্য মানুষের হাহাকার শুনেও নিঃশব্দে নীরবে ও গঙ্গা তুমি গঙ্গা বইছ কেন? The term hahakar was used by Shushmaji. If we cannot hear the hahakar, the cries of despair of the Dalit women subjected to brutal violence in the Gangetic Plains, we cannot claim to be true representatives of the people of India. And far away from the Gangetic Plain, and I'm concluding, far away from the Gangetic Plain, I will conclude shortly. We mourn the death of Mohsin Sheikh, the young computer engineer in Pune. He belonged to the so-called aspirational class whose dreams for the future had been fired by the election campaign of the ruling party. He did not live to see the Achhe Din, the good times the government promises to usher in. His only fault was that he wore his identity in his headgear and attire as he returned home after praying to the Almighty. Hockey sticks that had once done our nation proud in the world of sports were used as weapons to bludgeon the expression of diversity. The composition of the 16th Lok Sabha does not reflect the rich diversity of India as well as it should. That is why our special duty and responsibility is to give voice to the needs and aspirations of underrepresented minorities. If you truly want to be the harbinger of good times, I would say to this government, do not confuse uniformity with unity, majoritarianism with democracy.
I think that should be sufficient, and I'll pause here so that we can have a conversation.
I vote for Sugata.
Well, a number of interesting issues have arisen here. And there are other important examples that come to mind about cultural work and its ability to actually create both social uplift as well as passion. For instance, the Venezuelan music Abreo's it's El Sistema, which has not only been extraordinarily successful in Venezuela and other parts of Latin America, but this very disciplinarian project in classical music learning, where however disadvantaged you may be, and Senor Abreu mentioned this to me himself. It's however needy you might be, if you do not deliver, the instrument is taken away from you, and then at some point, again, if you want to join, you have to prove your colors again. But the interesting thing is the scalability of this project. So now there are schools in New York, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, where of course they have a conductor who came from the Sistema. The symphony has a conductor. So that's one project. Now, that has been a very hopeful project, and it has really worked across, not only across the Americas, but also in Bombay, in my city, which Sugata only partially correctly said was not a great city of culture. For those of us who love Bollywood dancing and Bollywood music, there is no other city, either in the world, leave alone in India. So, Sugata, a rap on your knuckles. But having said that, he's of course right. The elite,
about Kolkata, the lack of commerce there.
the elite, the mass of kind of great elite cultural work and production has been in Calcutta. But still, and also there's a great depth of that tradition in Calcutta. But even in Bombay now, elements of the Sistema, supported by the Melli Mehta Musical Foundation, are developing a deeply rooted and democratic organization for the education of children. On the other hand, our close friend and my college mate Anand Patwardhan, whose film on the Dalits we showed here, showed how over the years Dalit protest, that is the protest of the untouchables, the protest of the casteless, and in many senses the classless, Dalit protest used theatrical performance as part of both political consciousness raising, but also the creation of constituency and community. And of course, that story is a much sadder story, both because the way in which the parts of the untouchables, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, have moved through the influence of the Shiv Sena towards the, at least in India, in Bombay, towards, with the Shiv Sena, who are the kind of regional nationalists, if not soft fascists. You shouldn't say it, but I can. They've moved in that direction, and many of this, and this kind of whole very, very vibrant theatrical political tradition has died out. So one of the questions, I think, really, in fairness to everybody, and I'd just like to put my question, is how far does civic play, as you use the word, play, the ludic elements, how far does it go? How far can it go? And how far has it gone in changing state policies of the big state? I have a certain connection, a close personal connection to Colombia. And whereas I'm told that there has been a great improvement in the crime issues, things have become actually considerably worse in recent times. So it interests me to know how far this kind of civic consciousness through theater can actually impact on state policies to do with the democracy of education, to do with water, to do with health issues, to do with these major infrastructural issues, and how we might be able to think of them in that context. Would you like to take the first?
Yes. I would answer with fragments. It's not a systematic change what is occurring. Most of political corruption comes when you try to be reelected. The first election is an easy, very easy game. But the second time, the realists say, you want to gain the elections, you have to accept many compromises. So the rivalry between the different strategies in elections is very clear. It's, for many years, all manifestations were built with buses and people paid. So I remember once people just taking food, and on a certain moment, the candidate, the speaker, raises his voice, da 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 da, and in that moment, people put the food on the table, on their lap or on, and they applaud. So Well, in my case, the campaign members were shouting, yo vine porque quise, a mí no me pagaron. I came because I wanted to, but
Nobody paid me.
nobody paid me. Santos was very intelligent, and his answer was, he's describing the slogan, and he said, you are pretending to be the only ethic people. So you have to allow in politics that very different people can be honrados, honorable.
That was Santos's position. He said that the people can be honorable in different ways.
Yes, yes. And he accused me of making a sort of monopoly of the good people. We also, for infrastructure, we had the big programs made mainly by engineers, because its complexity, because the priority in that point was technical, strong structure. But in the local planning that involved 10% of all the incomes, tax incomes from the city, people were invited to vote priorities, and they received a paper, my idea for the city, each one put on the paper, and they had a token, public resources, sacred resources, and they were voting between 6 priorities and backing some special projects. Well, this was very micro, but for example, if a community wanted to buy motorcycles for police, they had to classify the objective of having police with motorcycles. And there were 2 objects: civic culture, so the motorcycles have to be justified by the cultura ciudadana objectives, or legitimidad institutional legitimacy. So in first case, crime has to go down. In the second case, the violations of human rights have to be reduced, and police cannot use means that are criminal means. So in some ways, well, I like a lot confessions, but after comes the punishment. But
I'm the father confessor. Don't worry. Don't worry, my son.
Okay,
Don't worry.
okay.
Talk,
Yes.
and I will give you my blessing.
Okay. So, well, many times people said, we do not understand what Antanas says, but we trust him. So it's not very Habermasian situation. So there is a struggle in the book about what can be an exception, and the end of the book, about the hints, suggests that perhaps all the things that we have done are just hints. It's like opening. Well, my feeling after the first year was 3 or 4 results, like homicide reduction, and so there was reasons for continuing. And we wrote in the cemetery, "The life is sacred," and an artist came and write, "Only with flowers we can." So we can make life recognize it as sacred only with flowers. I am not so naive to think that it's only with flowers. But the flowers testify that another perspective is in the background. So perhaps we are, yes, in this moment, the former mayor of Medellin has a very strong attention internationally because of his plan of social architecture. So if I think about him, I can say that I'm not alone, and Colombian society, not putting all the eggs in the same gasket, there is many cases local, and there is this big case of Medellin that shows that things can continue. Well, in some sense, the name Cultura Ciudadana has been banned. Perhaps for too much association with myself. So people say Cultura Ciudadana, that's Antanas. Antanas is not, well, did not gain the election, so, but I think that we can rescue the work of the people that were specialized in the program of Cultura Ciudadana. Rock al Parque, I'm sorry putting high, so small thing, but it's 3 or 4 days where people make rock. The most risky exercise I did with youngers was making a mixed concert of rap and rock. And in that case, people were both frustrated, too much. Well, so perhaps the classroom is like the recreo. It's just the time for playing a little bit and coming back. Well, in Bogota, corruption has come back. Well, in Bogota, we are sort of leftists. So many people, not being from the left, when we see someone convincing from the left, we vote for them. And unfortunately, the most patrimonial, the patrimony, the most important patrimony of left was reputation of honest behavior. And they have destroyed that. Mimes cannot put fines, but can unbetter things. In mathematics, you call it existence theorems. You find not the solution, but you prove that there is a solution. So this continuity problem is real. A good idea in that sense was Reykjavik in Iceland. There was also a mayor, a strange mayor. He worked in the comedia, ¿cómo se dice?
Yeah, he was a stand-up comic.
Stand-up comic, put out of the scholar system because being hyperactive, having syndrome of attention, and he invented a new party called the Best Party. So in the journals, the Best Party is written. So you have publicity inherent.
In the joke?
Yes. Sorry. No, please. Oh, it's the name of a film that is being made about all this story is The Life is Sacred. So perhaps I should grip to the reduction of homicides and saying as much as homicides continue to be, well, on the world, it's about 9 per 100,000. In Bogota, it was 80, and it's now 16. So we continue to be almost the double of the world, the double violence. But we have reduced, and it's stable. The country homicide rate is 30. For some reasons, I have been interested in the fact that we managed to maintain suicide rates at low level. Incidentally, if you sum up violence in homicides and violence in suicides, Lithuania is the champion. So we want people to respect the others. The only country that has more suicides than homicides in Latin America is Uruguay. And Uruguay is the only, well, the capital of Uruguay is the only city of 46 cities that we have been studying with the enquete,
Surveys.
with surveys, the only city where people think that the other people are like themselves, governed by morality and able to understand by good means, is Montevideo. So Uruguay, by its natural history, without any intervention of Cultura Ciudadana, without any mimes, and has better realized the ideals that drive us. Yes.
Thank you very much. Let's open up to the audience, and then we can field questions to our panelists. Yes, please.
So we have heard a lot about art projects being directed by. Excuse me. So we have heard.
Who you are, please?
Yeah. So I'm Daniel Martinez. I'm a sophomore at the college. So we heard a lot about art projects being directed from the state, so from an above approach. But I want to know sort of things that emerge from society, and especially referring to Bogota. Bogota has a lot of graffitis around the city. So I want to know what is, sort of, in your opinion, what is sort of the importance of the different kind of art or expression that graffitis present, knowing that it comes from people in a way that is classified as illegal, but it has been sort of taken by the state recently to propose things like in Colombia, things about the conflict. So what is the role of this kind of art?
Thank
graffiti?
you. I'm actually going to give this question first to Sugata, who also talked about graffiti in Kolkata, then to Doris, and then bring you in at the end if you don't mind. Yeah.
Yes, what Doris has called creative top-down interventions are actually city-level interventions by an unusual mayor, such as Antanas Mockus. And what she describes as bottom-up, sort of welling up kinds of creativity. One example, I suppose, is Augusto Boal and his theatre of the oppressed. Now, the difference that I see between Bogota and Kolkata, or Colombia and India, is that we have lots of civil society groups, civil society movements, who are engaged in wonderful civic innovations. But I don't think that any individual representing that kind of a campaign has been able to win power at the level of the city government in the way that Antanas Mockus has. And what I was trying to explain in my brief remarks was that, city mayors belong to political parties, and therefore they are answerable to higher-ups in the hierarchy at the level of the state or even the national level. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of creativity in cities such as Mumbai and Kolkata. The graffiti that I showed, I was completely taken aback. I took a snap decision to accept an invitation to contest for Parliament. And before I knew it, I went out into the streets, and there were beautiful posters done very sort of artistically, wall writing, as they say, of the sort that you saw. I simply used an English version, but there are many more beautiful ones using the Bengali script. So I wasn't even in charge of all this. The little cards that I showed you atop cycle-driven vans, quote unquote, I had nothing to do with it. I arrived to campaign in a particular village, and clearly lower level sort of political sort of workers and artists of that particular area had created all of that. So there is something happening from below. But when it comes to major initiatives, I still feel that it comes too much from the top. And I'll just give one example and stop. We are supposed to be building 100 smart cities in India. This is a campaign launched by the central government based in Delhi. And it's still not very clear to me, what the definition of smartness is for these projected cities of the future. Certainly, I haven't seen anything in what's been circulating about the role of the humanities or the arts or of culture, or even of universities located in these cities, what role they will play. It all seems to be very technology-driven, in the same way as what I read in the Harvard Gazette this morning about a new book written by two Harvard professors, and I don't want to be unfair to them, but the emphasis seems to be on fiber connectivity. And if you are able to somehow manipulate lots of data and feed them in, then you would be able to have a smarter administration in cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston. But in fact, my sense is that that will not do the trick in cities like Kolkata or Mumbai. I'm not against technology. We can actually use technology sort of creatively, but without actually going in and engaging with people, particularly those with an artistic orientation, in the neighborhoods, in the sort of, the villages around the major cities, I don't think we'll be able to create genuinely, smart cities. So there is a need for much more of these creative people on the ground level to be heard, rather than be dictated to and be told to carry out a street cleaning campaign or a cleansing campaign that's of the sort that's going on in India, which started on Gandhi's birthday on the 2nd of October, which basically cleanses all of the rich Gandhian ethos of all its diversity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes.
I think that we shouldn't minimize the effects of bottom-up movements. El Sistema is one. Boal is another. These are major movements that educate broad bases of citizens. And one thing that, and to think also of Mao Zedong, before he became a major political leader, he was a graffiti artist. I mean, one of the things that the Chinese history teaches us is that he made the largest graffiti project that's yet documented. Okay, so there's a way of understanding a political career as having incorporated some of the dynamics that art can ignite.
I would be a bit careful here, Doris, because, of course, but also Mao in his later years presided over something which was called the Cultural Revolution.
I know.
And I still remember those days in Kolkata. There were graffiti artists taken in by Mao's slogan of a cultural revolution and his hailing of the Naxalbari uprising as the spring thunder of the Indian Revolution. And the graffiti artist plastered all of the walls of Calcutta with posters of Mao saying China's chairman is our chairman.
Yeah.
And at great cost to the youth of
No, I'm sure, and there's no safe way to engage art. I know that that's a concern because art can work in one direction or another. The
and
question
you do
is,
wonderfully well in your book to talk
Yeah.
about both the dictatorial and the democratic effects of art, and where do you...
yes, yeah, but not to consider the effects of art when we think about politics, as I say also in the book, is like forbidding people to use language because language can curse. We are all artists. So the question is, how do we engage in collective and creative ways? The trickle-up effects, as I say, are important. And I've been learning, and thanks to Lisa Crossman here, I have just the beginnings of information about American cities who are identifying roles for artists in city government, not to do the work that's already being done, but to consult with officials, elected officials and appointed officials, to give hunches, to give asomos, to give ideas of what might be done. I think that there is a role for this kind of incorporation of creative energies, which is not a silver bullet. We don't know exactly where it's going to go, but it needs to be monitored. We need to exercise our judgment and fan this kind of creativity. I remember talking to a very successful businessman with political pretensions, and he said, I know Antanas Mockus, I admire him greatly, but I'm not him. I couldn't do what he did. I said, don't worry about it. When you have some power, hire some artists and let them debate over what kinds of moves may work and may not, and you get into the debate. I think we haven't identified these roles in small and large ways in governments. And as a major university, I would like to just float this possibility as a career path and engage more cities like Portland, Oregon, in thinking about how to harness some of this energy, which is not smart in the technological way that you say, but wise and clever. I think that the cleverness, the surprise element of art is much more productive than we have recognized in a public way.
You want to say a word on this?
Yes, perhaps a very small thing. We've founded a party that is called Visionarios. One of the recent works of Visionarios is in unsecure places in Cali, very insecure. They have put photos 4 meters by 2 meters size. And they have worked at a concourse with the community what to put on that photographs. We have some money for putting big photographies where the youngsters walk. And the community choose the photographs, portraits of las abuelas.
Grandmothers.
Of grandmothers that are particularly respected. One of the members of the team reports me that a youngster was smoking a joint? And he looked at the grandma, and my grandmother, it's better that she doesn't see.
Another question. Sorry.
Yeah. No. That's a little asomo.
Thank you so much. Questions, please? Yes. I'm going to take the lady here first, and then I'm going to take you. Please. I think you'll be receiving a mic in a second. Just introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name's Helen Hayes. I'm in the education Is it on? Yes, it is. Yeah, I was very struck by the purpose and function that art seems to be having in the various discourses you're presenting. I'm looking forward very much to reading Doris's book, which I haven't read yet. Probably she answers all the questions I want to raise. It seems to me that, oversimplifying it, there seem to be three things that art can do in the context that you're talking about, the civic world. One is the thing you talked about, Doris, initially, of paying attention to the fact that since the Enlightenment, we've lived in an over-cognitivized world. My field is psychology. It's dominated by cognitive thinking. We ignore affect to a large extent, except pathologically. And it's horrifying how little work's been done on the role of emotion in ordinary life. And I think that art, as you're describing it, art is a means by which affect is brought back into everyday life, and the expression and experience of emotion is something that you're showing in your examples of art, bring us to an awareness and an emotional experience. So that's one thing, is that art brings an affective dimension, which is necessary in the political sense. The second one is surprise. I mean, I think the thing that Antanas is talking about particularly is the use of surprise, art as surprise. And I think also Sugata is talking about it too, that art is wonderfully surprising, and art, because it's surprising, it can change the way we think, it can alter the way our expectations, it can shake us up. It's a bottom-up little revolution inside all of us. And it seems to be a very powerful and valuable role. The third role of art, which I think you just began to talk about at the end, is actually art as a form of communication, a form of expression, a form of saying the things in a way which has high impact, and that was really not touched upon. So
Your question, please.
My question. Well, I suppose I'm saying, am I accurately reflecting the importance of the art as surprise seems to be the strong thing, rather than the art as expressing perhaps ideas? I'm asking if surprise is a valid way of interpreting this.
May I?
Please.
Okay, very briefly, it's the name of art. If it isn't surprising, it already responds to that which we know. It needs to catch us off guard. But catching us off guard leads not only to affect, but to judgment. And that's the missing piece of the Enlightenment for Kant. It's judgment. We need to pause, ask ourselves, what was that response about? Do other people have that response? And that's what creates a lateral relationship. So you're absolutely right to say that surprise is an element here, and it's an element of communication precisely because we can share something that we can't name yet. And so that sharing allows us then to name it and to generate a new concept. So without thinking about art in this way, it's very difficult to think of conceptual innovation.
Yes, please. And no, sorry, there's this gentleman here, and then yourself, yeah.
Hello. I live and teach in India. I'm visiting here as a postdoctoral fellow at Weatherhead Center. It's not a question, but rather my pessimism, and I'm putting it before this very, very distinguished panel, with the hope that they can put some hope, or they can, find some way out for me in
My
this.
dear friend, usually I like to take problems as questions, only because otherwise we enter into a situation where people can't actually participate because everybody gives a little mini lecture. If you wouldn't mind doing it.
Just that. The two things. One is that I would be even more worried than Professor Bose, because we had a cartoonist from your city, Professor Bhabha, Bal Thackeray, and he was a cartoonist. But what he turned out in the organization which he set up, called Shiv Sena, is one of the worst, divisive, fascist, whatever words we can use. So that is one which leads to my pessimism. And the second is the city where I live, which has recently been changed from a much larger state called Andhra Pradesh into a smaller called Telangana. And the entire, the appropriation of art into creating the divide and conflict rather than the conflict resolution. They are replacing the statues, they are changing the names of the universities, putting the different kind of poets, changing the curriculum of the course. So I mean, that's my anxiety.
Yeah, it's a very, I think that's an extremely salient issue that, every party can use, or every party, every ideology can use to its own benefit the visual, pictorial work it wants. The issue is work on the political right, or the very conservative right, can be as surprising and as wonderful as work on the left. And so there is no way of ensuring. You need something beyond surprise, and you need something. You need a certain form of judgment, which also has both a commitment to the present, but also a historical perspective as to how to interpret these things. Because these are not new issues. Every time they happen, they are different and new, absolutely. But they also have an important history. Can we have another? Yes, a question. Yes, 1 and 2. And then you want a question, Mary? No, and then I'm going to have to close. Yeah.
Okay, my name's Lisa Wong. I'm a pediatrician and a musician. And an update about El Sistema in Venezuela, which is, I think, very relevant to what you're talking about today, is that this year, for the first time, they've been bringing musicians to teach children who have cancer in the hospitals, and the children are practicing for hours on end. And then when they're discharged, they join into the nucleos that are outside. And I was very struck, Mr. Mockus, about what you said about the need of art, particularly when there is a depth of need, either because of governmental oppression or in this case, health. It turns out that the hospital, it's a beautiful thing, and I was very inspired, and I've been studying it for a long time during this year, to find that actually the hospital in which these children are being cared for, the numbers have been reduced. There's a lot of lack of medications now, and there's contamination of. So in this setting of a very difficult health situation, the beauty of this musical program that is not heard of anywhere else in the world is coming up, and I think there's that juxtaposition. So I'd love your comment on that.
That was an excellent contribution. Thank you very much. I'll have a final question.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Ricardo Santamaria. I'm from Colombia. Maybe this is a question for Antanas. I don't see Antanas as a cultural leader or as an artist. I see you as a very successful and clever politician in the way that you change the way of life of many people. I bought Antanas at least, 2 times, as I remember. What do you see yourself as a politician, as an artist, as a cultural leader?
Good question. What? I think that's a question for you.
Thank you. When I go to a hotel, there is a place for putting occupation. Occupation is not identity, but I put profession. So in some sense, I'm a politician that feels shame for being politician. Or I'm very close to a sort of systematic denial. Well, my wife is protesting after each intervention in public. She says, "Why do you destroy yourself?" And
is your wife here in the?
Yes.
Adriana?
Adriana's in the back, yeah.
All right. You'll have the last word on this.
She does.
Yeah. That's.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I read some times ago Carl Schmitt works about politics. For Carl Schmitt, politics is enmity. And I feel very strange situation when supposedly I should feel enmity. And I'm interested by the other guy, or by the other woman. So I use a Mobius strip. Sometimes I have it as a ring. for remembering that we are all on the same side of the structure. So one of the very clear advantages of the former mayor of Medellin is that he accepts himself as politician. I have not assumed completely. I remember Kafka, Metamorphosis.
Yeah.
Well, I'm contagiated by too much negative vision of politicians in Colombia. I do not feel well between politicians. But we worked at a candidature of 3 candidates campaigning together. And that was a sort of bye-bye, see you later with some politicians. But that I liked it very much, but it was a time-bounded project. Yeah.
Thank you. Sugata, are you a historian or a politician?
Well, we all have multiple identities, but I have I have been saying in practically all of the interviews that I've given that my primary identity is that of a historian and a scholar. That's what I have been doing all my life. And I'm simply trying to help out in the political sphere at a very critical moment in India's political history. So that's how I would address the question of identity. But I've also become something of an amateur psychiatrist since the middle of May, because the day the election results came out, on the 16th of May, a pall of gloom descended on all of my liberal and intellectual friends. And so I'm having to sort of actually carry the hopes of this community of scholars and intellectuals. And I was being a bit of a pessimist or a realist only in relation to Doris's profoundly hopeful book. But in India, I'm having to try and play the role of an optimist, even though I recognize that something which Walter Benjamin called a magic show is on in India. And as long as a substantial section of the electorate, nearly a third, remains entranced by that magic show, I think that the exclusivist interpretations of art and politics will have the upper hand vis-a-vis the more sort of inclusive versions. But we have to put forward the more inclusive versions. And if this magic show goes on for 10 years, then there will be trouble. There will be a change in India of the sort that took place during 11 years of Ziaul Haq's state-sponsored Islamization in Pakistan. India may well be transformed. But if we can limit this magic show to 5 years, then maybe there is hope, and maybe the more sort of inclusive discourses on art and politics may begin to push back what's going on in the name of cultural nationalism. Finally, I'm so glad that a question came from a pediatrician and a musician, because my father was a pediatrician. And when I went to Bangalore, the desperately poor areas where I showed you, I held some public sort of meetings, I could see, not even being a pediatrician, that the most of the children seemed to be terribly undernourished, malnourished. And so after getting elected, I asked the district administration to give me details on at least 3 villages where there are what are called the Integrated Child Development Services, the ICDS. And let me tell you, before I was coming to this meeting, I thought that I would have to ask Antanas Mockus that what can artists or humanities or the culture do when you find that the overwhelming majority of the children attending these Anganwadi, these are sort of the nurseries and the primary schools are malnourished. And I have now names, lists of names. And I felt that, I had to call upon my father's students, who are now the top pediatricians in Calcutta, to help out. But your dual identity as a pediatrician and a musician gives me hope that in addition to a certain kind of scientific expertise, a certain invocation of the humanities may also help in addressing such severe problems, which may seem on the face of it to be completely divorced from the humanities and culture.
But I must, on that note, ask you to just say for a minute to the audience here, to tell them about the projects you have in the medical school, because it's a larger humanities program than the one you just mentioned. Just a quick word.
We've realized, at Harvard Medical School, one of the criteria for admission is involvement in the arts, because we've realized that physicians who are involved in the arts, not only music but in theater or narrative writing, make more empathetic doctors, and it's also preventive for burnout. So we're trying to promote that as much as we can on the campus.
Wonderful.
I didn't want this to go without a moment where you actually said, if you go to on the 6th floor of the, the building of the, what's it called? Yeah, if you were to, when I go to see my medical practitioner, it's very interesting that there are 2 large portraits, and one of obviously celebrated doctors, and one of them has chosen to pose with his violin in his hand, to really to emphasize his playing of the violin and his involvement in culture. So thank you very much. Well, I want to thank our panelists. Thank you all very much for your very lively and also inspirational ideas. We will scale up, we will scale down, we will go in every direction that we can to assure our communities, our friends, ourselves of the importance of culture in public discourse and in political transformation. Thank you very much.